300,000 financial advisors in the US. And, so there's like 11 of us that are like focused on Bitcoin. So it's like a niche of a niche, but I think it's getting very hard for, wealth managers to ignore Bitcoin at this point. TradFi clients have just been really into, precious metals because they like understand that like the money's broken, but they maybe just don't understand Bitcoin. So it's like, okay, like you're into precious metals, you understand the money's broken. It's like, well, we're 90% of the way there. That to me is how a cycle, the 4-year cycle, like breaks in Bitcoin, where it's like now the floodgates are open and these large pools of capital can move into Bitcoin. I don't know if we're there yet, or this is like the last cycle, but I'm starting to see the early innings of that being possible.
Guys, welcome back to the show today. I'm here with Wyatt, which is CEO and founder of Basilic. How are you doing, man?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. I've seen you in Vegas. I was telling you off camera, you had a fantastic panel with Robin and Bram, and I'm so sorry I couldn't come and shake your hands, but I really enjoyed being there and, experiencing your panel. What do you think about Vegas, man? It was crazy, right?
Dude, it was crazy. I'm so happy you got to catch it. They're great guys. Brian did an awesome job moderating too. But, I do think like the Bitcoin conference is kind of like a little fun, microcosm of Bitcoin. I also helped found the space. I'm the CMO at the space. That's like Denver's Bitcoin Citadel, very similar like Bitcoin Park or, Lugano in Switzerland, has like a physical hub there. And so we're really, pretty event heavy. You can kind of think of it as like, social club meets event space meets co-working, kind of meets like professional trade organizations. So we do just a lot of like community focused events, trying to get people, to learn and, spread the mission of Bitcoin, if you will. And being like, I never really thought I would get into events. It's just kind of like happened. And so kind of like being involved with it, going to an event like that big, you're just like, holy smokes, like the amount of, resources and effort that go into it is really impressive. I think there were over, around 30,000 people or so this year. I feel like is like the number I've heard. And, it was an absolute honor, to participate and be a speaker this year. And I really think the Bitcoin conference is in, a league of its own, which is how many, people it attracts. So it's great, getting to see, a lot of your friends or, people you've connected with, online and, get to shake their hand. I really do enjoy that. But the other side of it, it was a madhouse, man. I think I was there for 5 days. I brought my wife, thankfully, and she helped ground me a little bit because otherwise it was just, sometimes I felt like a chicken with my head cut off. It's like meeting, this person, events, this night and that night. It was just like nonstop. So it's a ton of fun, but it's like, it kind of blows my mind, like how big it's gotten.
I was in Nashville last year, which was equally nice. And Trump was there. I mean, he wasn't the president yet, but he was there. He made a speech. They locked all the doors and it was crazy. But this time in Vegas was something else. So kudos to the Bitcoin magazine. Are you going to Hong Kong?
I'm not going to Hong Kong, but tentatively going to MENA.
I had a panel last year, which was amazing. It's only an hour by car away from me. Abu Dhabi is really close. So I'll definitely be there. So if you're coming this side of the planet, let me know.
Yes, I would love that.
Before we dive into the conversation, do you mind to give us an intro and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely, man. So I always kind of joke with people. I was like traditionally trained in finance and like a lot of good that did me. It's like I went to studied finance in college, just got like a Keynesian, finance degree, which was a total bummer. But I didn't really know it at the time. I was a kid, and I just thought, this was finance. So, like, this is the way that the system works. I first got exposed to Bitcoin in 2017. A guy I knew was like, literally selling drugs with it. So it just like fit every narrative, like every like FUD narrative I heard at the time. And, it's like, oh, it's drug money. It doesn't cash flow or anything like that. So I got a job after school. I've worked in various fields of finance, some real estate, some asset management, some IB and PE, but it wasn't really until 2020 where I went down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. It was COVID. I was locked in my apartment with my roommate who was a Bitcoiner, and he was just hammering me, and I couldn't escape him at that point. So I was like finally started listening to the podcast and just dug down the rabbit hole, from there. But I really just kind of identified more as a entrepreneur. I love business and the whole idea of like startups. So I had a startup that, previously went bust. And so this was in 2023. I was thinking, it's like, well, what do I do next? And at that point, I was a Bitcoin maximalist. I wanted to start another company, but it's like I couldn't code or anything. All my skills and experiences were in the finance industry. So I was like, shoot, going to start, a Bitcoin company. And so just talking with, friends and family, it kind of adopted like the RIA business model, registered investment advisor. So like financial advisor, I brand myself as like a Bitcoin financial advisor. We still do, TradFi work, but it's really, the firm is focused on, sound money strategies. So I work with a lot of Bitcoiners on, and we really focus on sound custody solutions. So kind of, my shtick is like, not 100% true, but more true than not. It's like I really, don't encourage people to blindly, buy the ETF. And quick caveat, not financial advice, educational purposes only here. My friends and my peers are other Bitcoin maximalists, and so I really just kind of built the firm in what I kind of deem like the Bitcoin ethos, and that's a lens I try to evaluate different businesses I do work with as well, partners and whatnot too. They fit into this Bitcoin ethos. Really focus on sound custody solutions. I partner with Unchained. So if my clients hold Bitcoin, it's the bare asset, custody ourselves, because we're not just in Bitcoin for the price exposure. We just view it that simply through that lens. Like we're missing so many of the unique and important aspects of Bitcoin. So really help other Bitcoiners be good stewards of their assets. I think that's crucially important. So, but there's also like this qualitative aspect, and how do we really embrace this asset and like what it means not only for ourselves in the current day, but our families or causes that are important to us in the future. And then also, I believe it's my fiduciary duty. If I have clients that don't have Bitcoin exposure or haven't heard of it, it's like I always bring it up. It's the best performing asset over the last 10 years, and so really help them address any FUD they may have heard, or help educate them on the network, the asset, and the technology, and start building some sort of position. But that's really kind of the long and short of Basilic. And then got a couple irons in the fire. We just had our first kid, which has been absolute blessing. We're really enjoying that stage of our life. And then like I mentioned earlier, help found the space, which I always tell people probably be the coolest project I worked on in my career. My wife and I take community very seriously, and in our lives right now it's predominantly like our church community and our Bitcoin community. And I just think there's so much importance of getting Bitcoiners off the internet. It's like this interesting conundrum where it's like internet native protocol. The community was largely born on the internet, which I think is very cool and very powerful, and big network state enthusiasts as well. So understand like the power that has, but I still don't think anything beats getting together in person. And so community building's hard. You have to be very intentional. You have to invest in people, get to know folks, and that takes a lot of time and effort, but man, is it rewarding.
A different feeling. I completely agree. And something I wanted to ask you, because you're coming from a traditional finance, right? So what do you think are the biggest question mark for someone who comes in from TradFi and goes, Bitcoin, what is this thing? Is there a set of things that scare people off?
Yeah, at this point, it's almost, I'll kind of focus, kind of on my niche or my sub industry of finance, which is kind of like wealth management, right? And so I think when I'm talking with like other wealth managers, there are growing number of I would say financial advisors that are accepting it. I'm part of the Bitcoin Financial Advisors Network, which is a great group of folks. We have like a website with educational resources, but we also have just like a quarterly like brain trust call. So we kind of go over different case studies we've encountered with our clients, like help each other like think through it. It's like still fairly new, and we're learning, and so it's just great having other professionals you can trust that are on the same page to bounce ideas off of each other. But I was doing some research on this the other day, and there's like 11 of us in the Bitcoin Financial Advisors Network, which, mind you, isn't like every financial advisor in the country that embraces or talks to their clients about Bitcoin. But there's 300,000 financial advisors in the U.S. And so there's like 11 of us that are like focused on Bitcoin. So it's like a niche of a niche. But I think it's getting very hard for wealth managers to ignore Bitcoin at this point. A lot of the pushback I get is just like some of the most common FUD. And so if you're hearing this at this stage in the game, it's like, okay, well, you're probably just lazy, to be blunt, and you haven't actually done the research to understand what Bitcoin is. And so that's unfortunate. But I think there is like unfortunately an interesting incentive game in the wealth management. A lot of the financial advisors and wealth managers have made their nut on like AUM, so assets under management, charging 1% fee on it, and Bitcoin kind of threatens that a little bit. I don't charge AUM on for my Bitcoin clients because I don't have custody of the asset. You have custody of the asset because you're a sovereign individual. And so if I help them in a Bitcoin aspect, it's generally like through financial planning, or I'm a key agent. I could hold a key for them in some instances, or help them get set up on the on-chain platform. So it's all flat fee based. And so I think a lot of the wealth managers in the U.S. are particularly hesitant to embrace Bitcoin because it challenges their business model.
I was wondering if from your experience, you've seen maybe generally more misinformation perhaps towards the asset as opposed to because they don't understand what it is.
Yeah, it's a great point. So what I did is I created like this menu. I call it like the Bitcoin menu, and so just kind of have like try to you gotta meet people where they're at, right? And so I try to identify some kind of broader categories, like, okay, are you into like economics? Are you into like sovereignty? And then identify like what they're into or like what resonates with them. It's like fairly easy. I have some TradFi clients that have just been really into precious metals because they like understand that like the money's broken, but they maybe just don't understand Bitcoin. So it's like, okay, like you're into precious metals, you understand the money's broken. It's like, well, we're 90% of the way there, So it's like now that I've identified, it's like what they're into or like their background or what they understand. Then try to approach Bitcoin from that angle. I think kind of the biggest pushback I get from people that are new to it is like the volatility, which is understandable. Bitcoin is still nascent asset class. We're like 16 years old now. There is volatility. OnRamp has this really good report that I cite where it's like, well, there's actually more good volatility than bad volatility, and then helping people understand where Bitcoin's still in price discovery mode. It's like, yes, we are going to have like some volatility. That's not necessarily bad thing. The good volatility means it just goes up at a higher clip than it goes down over the course of its history, and even when it goes down, it's like I get excited, because it was like, sats are on sale, and so like, how do we take advantage of that? But I've actually been, pretty fortunate. A lot of my, inbound is, actually pretty, well-established Bitcoiners. Like they've been in it for a while. They've stacked a decent amount of sats, and they talk to their, existing financial advisor, and they, brush it off or want them to sell, or, think they're overexposed, or, unfortunately, one client told me, they laughed at them, and so it's like that's not a good feeling, right? And so I think a lot of the value I add to my clients is we just speak the same language. It's like my clients think they're diversified because there's 70% Bitcoin and 30% MicroStrategy, and it's like a lot of financial advisors will freak out when they see that, but it's like I understand where they're coming from because we speak the same language, and it's like yes, it's like I get it. And so then it's really just kind of helping them understand like what they have in the context of their assets, and then we build a plan where it's like, how do we achieve your goals? I've adopted a financial planning philosophy called human first financial planning, and so we spend a lot of time identifying your goals and what's truly important to you, and then framing Bitcoin and the context of like, well, this is a tool that will help you get there.
People tend to understand inflation, right? They understand the cost of living
Yeah.
is going up. I'm not sure the majority of people care, to be honest. I call it CPI instead of CPI whenever they say the numbers.
Yes.
Right? There's actually an interesting chart that shows instead of every single iPhone you would have purchased Bitcoin, you would have now millions of dollars, to show how crazy A, Bitcoin has gone up, but B, the cost of living has gone insane. Everything is super expensive. There's places where with money they actually build items and they sell the items because the money is actually worthless. So the dollars, it's in a terrible state, but yet is one of the best in terms of storing value, right? Because it's lost 99% of its purchasing power since inception. And how bad do you think it is? Like, are we going to see the end of the dollar in our lifetime, or it's something maybe is going to happen down the line in a couple of 100 years?
I heard you say CPY episode a couple days ago, and I was like, oh, I'm going to steal that. Like, that is so good because it's true. And that's honestly one of the first things I identify with the client that I'm doing a financial plan for, because it's like, look, like CPI is a fake manipulated like statistic. Like we shouldn't trust it. I don't use it. I use 5.5 to 6% inflation in my financial plans just because that's M2 money supply. I actually probably undershooting that a little bit, but it's it's crazy. A lot of value in doing a financial plan is just making data driven decisions. So it's like, unfortunately, our lives have been financialized, and a lot of people have an old 401k here or a mortgage over there, and it's like they can't even like get everything into one spot to like understand. It's like where in your personal balance sheet where our assets and liabilities are. So we pull everything together, and then we do a plan. Like, forecasting is more of an art than a science, but it's still a valuable exercise because working with the client recently, they're a little bit younger, and so we have the plan going out to their 95, and so that's like 58 years of like modeling. Is like, are the numbers at the end accurate? It's like, no, obviously there'll be like ups and downs, but the value of that exercise is like, we really see how fast like costs grow at a 6% clip, compounding year over year. And so it's like, I just point out, it's like, okay, after you retired and you may not be on like your employer health insurance or something, like this is your out of pocket. It starts 35, it's like $6,000 a year. Well, it's like, well, when you retire 30 years from there, that $6,000 number is actually more like $50,000. And so it's just like crazy. And for this specific client, like I went back and asked ChatGPT, I was like, what was a bottle of Coke worth 58 years ago, right? And it was like 15 cents, and now it's like 250 or whatever. So it was like a 1,700% increase, right? It's because it's like, it's hard, when you just see the numbers on the screen, today, it's like, well, how could it like healthcare be, that expensive then, $50,000 a year, like sounds like a lot. It is a lot, but it's like, well, if you look back 58 years ago and see how cheap things were and where we are today, it's just really helping them frame the context of like the power of compounding. And that works against us in the terms of inflation. It also works for us in the terms of Bitcoin. To your point about the dollar, I'm very bearish on the dollar. I'm coming from like the Lynn Alden school of thought here, where it's like nothing stops this train. I do think we are in a couple different ways here. So I really try to frame this it's like morally first to kind of help people understand the context of what we're working with. And specifically with my Bitcoiner clients, I actually try to look back to history here. I'm really try to involve my faith in my work too. I'm a devout Catholic, and specifically Catholic tradition. Like, we have a long history. It's called like the noblesse oblige, which like nobility obligates. So it's like, it used to be, in the olden days, these wealthy aristocratic families like old Europe, like they had a very strong, moral compass. And so even if they were wealthy, they had this obligation to take care of like their hyper local, communities. Like, there's great examples of not only supporting like the church, but, building housing, like providing, jobs. So it was like the elites were actually like noble people. I think like a lot of the problem we're encountering now is our elites are trash. And it's unfortunate. It's like, dollar reserve currency of the world. I always tell people, we had the largest lead in history. We blew it. And that's likely just because of like poor leadership, right? It's like, it was ignorant of them to think, the U.S., specifically in 2000, we had a surplus. Now 25 years later, we're at $37 trillion in debt, increasing at a unsustainable rate that will never be able to pay off. So in the context of Bitcoin, I try to frame it. It's like, we're the first generation of Bitcoiners, whether we like it or not. We've been burdened with this responsibility. So it's like, do you have like the quantitative and qualitative tools to step into the role of being the 1% of political and economic power? And it's like my hope for Bitcoiners specifically, because it is this grassroots movement. Have you seen that graph that's been circulating on Twitter? It's like the Myers-Briggs personalities and Bitcoiners. I think that's pretty interesting. I'm not like super into like the personality testing, so like they're whatever, kind of interesting. But I think it's very interesting. A couple kind of personality types are very attracted to Bitcoiners. So I'm hoping, my hope for the future is that when Bitcoiners do step into this role, it's just a different type of person. Like, they're wired differently than like kind of our modern day elites. And so really kind of focus on making sure we're ready for that moment. So that's kind of like the moral understanding is like how we got here. But the qualitative side of it is I just get like super discouraged where with this administration was very optimistic with Doge and Elon and the talent in the administration. It's like, okay, this is probably like our once in a lifetime opportunity to cut spending and actually kind of make a dent on the blow of just how big the federal bureaucracy has gotten, and it absolutely fell on its face. So it's like, okay, if this isn't going to work, it's probably never going to work, and so we need to prepare, accordingly. I even think like Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, and Secretary, Commerce, like Howard Lutnick, kind of like understand like the problem. And there's been chatter of reshoring gold. This is kind of centered around like the sovereign wealth fund and trying to get real physical assets, back in the country and back on the balance sheet. But I think it's too late. But so we should still identify that trend as important, because the money is just so fake. Us as individuals can make change on our personal balance sheet, predominantly by buying Bitcoin. I still do think there are value in some other physical assets, depending on your individual circumstances. But it is a road to nowhere. And I do try to frame this too in the context of it's kind of like like the old sayings, like the bigger they are, the harder they fall. It's like, well, I almost think it's kind of like, not the most perfect analogy, but it's like the more complex system, like the longer it will take to like unravel. So I think that process has started, but it won't be a surprise. I think the dollar will more or less have collapsed in our lifetime, but it won't necessarily mean like the end of the dollar. Like the dollar has prolificated so staunchly around the world, like it's touched nearly every corner, every person practically. And so it's going to take a long time to like unravel. It's like, well, dollar still exists. Like, yes, I think the infrastructure of dollars still exists for potentially 100 plus years. That doesn't mean it's going to be like worth anything, or something people desire. It will still just technically be in existence.
The purchasing power, that's the illusion, because you have technically the same amount of money in your bank account, even though we say always the three rules: not money, not in the bank, not yours. It doesn't have to be Bitcoin, the answer, but you have to think about how to protect your energy, or whatever you want to label it, your retirement plan, whatever that might be. If you don't think about acquiring assets, you're going to face a really sad story later on. And how do you think Bitcoin is going to come and save us from this mess?
Yeah, well, it's a phenomenal point. I talk about this in my book, The Bitcoinization of Finance, where when we look at macroeconomics, like I'm a fan, just like I'm into that sort of thing, so I enjoy it. But we have to be careful, because like we're talking about like such complex systems. Like it's easy for us to identify certain data points and like draw our own conclusions, based on our own biases, or where we see things going. So I think it's a useful exercise to like pay attention to macro, but it's important for us to like not necessarily get like so in the weeds, because we just like there's so many variables at play. It's like we don't know how things are playing out. So I just try to like think pretty high level, about this stuff, and identify, trends and themes. And so, I'm big into like the four turning thesis. I'm big into like Ray Dalio's like 250-year, sovereign debt thesis. And if you line those up, like they're almost like perfectly, aligned, with kind of like this era we're in right now. Let's say just, 2025 to like 2050. So it's like we have like these over the next 25 years, I think like some big macro headwinds that I think will kind of be the end of one era and the start of a new era. You kind of mentioned globalization. I think that was kind of like a good idea in a textbook. Like it makes sense, but in practicality, it's like it really kind of hollowed out the West and destroyed the middle class. And pick a country, it's like the same story over and over again. And that's what I kind of mean about identifying these themes. And so Jeff's Booth line that I just think like I use a lot, because it really hammers home like the point, especially to normies. But it's like when the money's not scarce, it will flow to scarce assets. And so it's like in the West, specifically in America, I think the euro is probably a pretty close comparison. So it's like all we've outsourced over last 25 35 years. I kind of think globalization kind of really started early 90s, end of the Cold War, and we've just outsourced dollars and equities, and we've completely moved any sort of manufacturing of like real things offshore to different centers, because it could be done cheaper. And the side effects of that are really devastating. I'm originally from like the Midwest, and it's very easy to see the consequences and the devastation of globalization there, just because that's where a lot of like raw materials were harvested. That's where a lot of manufacturing was. And so I always say have a great appreciation. If like you're driving through Nebraska or something, like all you see is like cornfields, but then you come up across a small town that has like grain silos and a railroad yard, and it's like, well, that's how you physically get goods to market. It's like these are important systems that are hanging on by a thread because their economic measuring stick is just crumbling underneath them. And so with this like new order that I think Bitcoin will kind of usher in, it's just like grounding everything in reality. Because if you have like an economic measuring stick that is consistent across space and time, you are now like accounting for those goods in the Midwest physically coming to market, and the textiles that get made in Asia, if they're all using the same unit of account. It's like, well, now we can actually track these things comparatively for the value that they provide to ultimately like the end user. And I think Bitcoin too is like one of the things people underappreciate about it is like it's a truly free market. It's like agriculture in the US is like heavily subsidized. My father-in-law is like a farmer, and it's really like if you're sitting at your desk in DC, it's like, oh, we're helping these farmers out. It's like, well, no, you're hurting them because you're distorting like the cost of their goods and their labor and their sweat, as you were referencing, that they put into deliver a good to market. And so it's like we have all these fiat distortions that really hide like the true value of like your work and your effort. And that really has, I think, a profound psychological effect on people, because you essentially force everybody to become gamblers instead of educated capital allocators, right? So if you have no idea what the true cost of anything is, like you're just guessing or hoping that whatever you do, however you put your labor and capital resources into your craft, that it's going to work out for you in the end. But that's just really like a hope. Like Bitcoin is like a true global free market that is consistent economic measuring stick. Well, now me as an allocator, it's like, well, I can make a informed data driven decision because like my measuring stick isn't constantly moving.
Where do you think we are in the market? Because you, of course, you've seen a bunch of cycles. Do you think we are topping? Do you actually care? Are you honey badgering into it? And if we go to 200,000 or if we drop to 90K, you remain impartial? What's your view?
Actually, I mean, I check the price an unhealthy amount every day. I always have a tab open, so it's like I'm always like aware of like where the price of Bitcoin is. But to your point, I actually don't care. We're in it for the long haul, and so when I'm framing the context of this, whether it's working with a client that's new to Bitcoin or a client that has a substantial amount of Bitcoin, generally we're trying to do two things. It's acquire more Bitcoin and preserve our current Bitcoin holdings. And because of Bitcoin's unique qualities, like a finite fixed supply, that's how we get to like Bitcoin as a savings technology. And so generally there are a couple different acquisition type strategies you can pursue, volume based, or I always tend to just start with a DCA. I think that's like tried and true. So if you're just consistently buying small amounts of Bitcoin, and you get to a point where you have to spend it, it's like one of the things I do push back that I see a lot in the Bitcoin community is making Bitcoin an idol. It's a tool, it's money. Let's understand it appropriately. And so as your life changes, you should utilize the tools available to you to better your life. And so in some contexts where it's like I'm more bearish real estate than not, but if you want to buy a forever home because you think your family can enjoy that for generations, like, and that's important to you, then yeah, we should spend some Bitcoin to like do that. So it's like strategically identifying big goals, where we want to spend Bitcoin or where we think it's appropriate to spend Bitcoin. Like that's perfectly fine. And then if you're DCAing, buying when it's high, buying where it's low, like there's a good chance like you're going to be up on that, and it's like you still made out in the end, even if you sold some Bitcoin. If you're living on Bitcoin standard and your life is just fully denominated in Bitcoin, again, and your car breaks down, you got like $1,000 mechanic bill, and you got to sell at the top, it's like, well, or even selling at the bottom, it's like if you've been committed to it, like there's still a good chance like you're up on that initial investment. And again, even if you're down, you still are protected from that 6% inflation erosion. So it's like regardless of where you bought, like you're probably up 6% alone by, not dealing in, fiat currency. So it's just kind of like understanding and framing like the context. And then when it comes to, Bitcoin preservation, a lot of times, everybody's, financial circumstances are unique, but a lot of people can benefit from just having like a cash buffer. So it's like, okay, if something unforeseen does happen, I can actually have like a little cash I can spend to like preserve my Bitcoin. I'm really tapped into and I'm super bullish on like entrepreneurs in the Bitcoin financial services, industry that are building tools like, Ledin, like Firefish, Unchained has a very good loan product. So it's like, we can utilize a lot of different, tools and financial products now in the Bitcoin system that just really kind of open up, our realm of opportunities. So it's like, yeah, okay, if I have a big purchase, dollar denominated purchase I want to make, or, if something unforeseen happens, I need, dollars in a crunch, like, can I use my Bitcoin as collateral to get, a fiat denominated loan, attack that consequence, either pay off the loan or, Bitcoin appreciates, where you can sell some of that to pay off like the loan. And then you're essentially at like net zero to begin with. So I am super excited about, all the developments, specifically within like the Bitcoin financial services space that just like give people the tools, products, and strategies that have been, available in TradFi for forever that are, now coming about in Bitcoin. So, depending how far, people want to go down the rabbit hole or, how much, exposure they want to Bitcoin, it's like, there's so many different levers like you can pull.
And like you said so well, it is your fault and you have to fix it. You have to take care of it. And this is the best part, that
Right.
you can become responsible for your own awakening. Take care of your body, take care of your, of course, family, loved ones, take care of your money, right? But these, again, I think it's filtering down a profile of people, and some, they rather point a finger. Oh, no, it's not my fault, it's the government. Or it's not my fault, it's my wife or my husband, whatever it is. Whether when you take the keys in your hands, it's on you. So that's one of the most interesting part, at least for me.
Absolutely, man. Yeah, no, we need to reject that. It really creates like you're just building on this sense of despair, where it's like, I'm a victim, like something's happened to me. And it's like, that's not the case. You have either the capabilities or existing, skills or your tool set to go out and build a future for yourself. I firmly believe that. And, something I left out, it's like where we're at with the market and cycles. I really try to hone in this. It's kind of like the thesis and crux of my books. Like I wrote this because, as a finance guy getting into Bitcoin, like my maximalist friends like always make, fun of me or, poke me in the ribs, where it's like, well, finances, sucks or whatever. It's like, yeah, I mean, there's been I'm kind of sympathetic to that argument at times, just because, there's been a lot of bad actors, in finance. But, I think fiat is pervasive in every industry. I can't remember the author's name right now, but, it's like the book Fiat Food, right? So they're just, highlighting how all these like fiat tendencies and practices like made its way into the food system. It's like, well, finance is no different. And I just kind of think of, finance broadly as like the business of money. So I'm hesitant to say there's no, like the cycles are over, right? Because like Bitcoin is a very unique, asset. And some of the pushback I have on a lot of the analysis in Bitcoin is a lot of times, we're using, equity tools or analysis techniques and apply it to Bitcoin. And I think there are some, pertinent metrics there, but a lot of times you're just trying to fit like a, round peg into like a square hole. And so it's like, it's not perfect, but, and like I said, I'm hesitant to, say it's like the end of cycles, because, that would be saying something that hasn't happened, yet. Like, history shows us like, because of Bitcoin's, uniqueness, and there's a lot of different factors that go into it. It does kind of follow like this 4-year cycle. But where I'm really kind of seeing like the finance industry, going in general, is like in TradFi, have all these, tools, products, and strategies to deploy capital in different ways. And now we're starting to see that, really develop in the Bitcoin space. And, as Bitcoiners, that's something we shouldn't be afraid of. It's like, I think, specifically in Bitcoin, like finance gets like this really bad name. It's like, well, there's nothing bad about, a futures or an options contract. It's literally, a tool and business contract. It's like you're two parties taking a side of the trade. So if we plug like Bitcoin into that, like, and I think this is kind of like the underlying trend of like the Bitcoin treasury company, phenomenon. It's like, are we developing are utilizing those existing, TradFi tools and applying them to Bitcoin, because that's ultimately is what's going to get like the largest pools of capital to, move into Bitcoin. It's like they need a lot of times, whether it's, some sort of like fund mandate or whatever, they can't just buy, spot Bitcoin, or, they, want to utilize leverage. Like these aren't bad things. Like now, we're seeing, a lot of those tools develop. So those TradFi, pools of capital can move into Bitcoin in large ways. I think we're really kind of at the cusp of that. And, I always reference Jesse Meyer's store value, chart. So, Bitcoin's in competition with other store value assets, and these large capital pools have the tools, products, and strategies available to them to make considerable moves into Bitcoin. That to me is how the 4-year cycle like breaks in Bitcoin, where it's like now the floodgates are open and these large pools of capital can move into Bitcoin. I don't know if we're there yet, or, this is like the last cycle, but I'm starting to see the early innings of that being possible.
We discussed it briefly off camera, right? Like we say this time is different every single time.
Yeah. Right.
But yet this asset is growing, right? So it's a teenager. It's going to be different. At some point, it's going to break out from these 4-year cycles because, like you said, capital is going to flow into it. So it's going to change the dynamic. And even though it's quote unquote always the same, it's technically not, because I don't think if you look into history, first of all, there is a diminishing in either way. So it goes up less, but also down less. Time will tell. I mean, so far, I still believe we are into a 4-year cycles until proven otherwise, but I guess we'll find out soon, because technically it should be October,
right.
The top of the cycle, right? So it's definitely going to be interesting to see what's going to happen. But me, like you, I don't care. I just do the math every 2 or 3 cycles. So whatever we have now, we're going to look back and thinking, oh man, remember $100,000 high was cheap.
Yeah.
A few years from now.
Right.
That's the vibe. But Wyatt, I mean, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Guys, as always, all the links are going to be in the description, so make sure to go check Basilic, check your book.
Hey, thanks so much, man. Super appreciative. The pleasure is all mine.
Fantastic. And I hope to see you soon, maybe in Mena. Fingers crossed.
Yes, fingers crossed.
Fantastic. And guys, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.